So in a previous video, we talked about creating a load balancer, and a load balancer can be used for a variety of different types of services in Azure. Another tool we have is a web application gateway, and this is a little more specific. We use this specifically to deal with web traffic. In a load balancer, we forward traffic based on IP address and port number. In a web application gateway, we can actually do it. So a load balancer works basically at layer 3 and 4 of the OSI model. A application gateway can work at layers 4 and 7 of the OSI model. Let's talk about how we're going to do this. So I'm going to do a search for application gateways. And when I do it, it's going to find application gateways here. Now, this is actually part of your load balancing services. So here in your load balancing services, you'll see here's where we do our load balancers. Here's where we do our application gateway. All right, I'm going to create an application gateway. And I'm going to specify the resource group that it belongs to. So I'm going to do demonstrations. And then we're going to give it a name. And I'm going to call this Demo App Gateway. All right, I can do this. My tiers, I have a basic, a standard, or a WAF. Now, WAF is going to engage the web application firewall. And that's something we can add to this. Remember, this is specific for web applications. So we can do some specific firewalling on there if we bump this up to the WAF. The standard v2 does not include that. You can see here it includes performance enhancements support for some new critical features. Choose WAF to support the web application firewall. Okay, you can do that later on too. So do we want to enable auto scaling? Yes or no? Auto scaling will automatically scale it up for us. We're going to go ahead and leave that at the moment. We have a minimum instance count, which means if there's very little to no traffic, how many instances are we going to reserve? Obviously, the more reservations we have, the more system resources it eats up, so the more it charges us for it. And then down here, HTTP v2, IP address type, do we want 4, dual stack with 4 and 6? And then which virtual network are we going to tie this to? And I'm going to tie this to my demo virtual network right here. It identifies the subnet, and if I have more than one subnet, I can choose different subnets there. All right, which front end do I want this, or let me set up my front end. There we go. So I can do a front end as public, private, or both. And if I have a public IP defined, like I do right here, I can choose this front end IP. If I don't, I can create add new, and that will create a new IP address for me. I'm going to go ahead and use the one that I have. So if you have not created it, you just go to add new, give it the name, the SKU, the assignment. All right, pretty straightforward. Okay. Backends. Now, kind of like a web application, or kind of like the load balancer, the front end IP and then the backends that I'm going to distribute data to. And that's going to be in a pool. So just like we did with the load balancer, I'm going to add a backend pool. And this gives me the option right here. I love this. I can add a backend pool without adding targets, yes or no. So if I say yes, then I just have to give it the name. Let's do backend app pool. If I say no, then I can add my targets right now. And I can do this by IP address or FQDN. Since I don't have any IP addresses or FQDNs to set up, FQDN, fully qualified domain name, would be the name of the server that I was using for my backend pool. I'm going to leave this as yes, add it without the targets, and then I can come back and add the targets later, which is something we'll frequently do, whether we're creating this with targets or not. We may find ourselves adding more later. So I want to show you how to do that. So I'm going to click add, and that adds my backend. So next is going to be my configuration. This is kind of cool. So here's my front ends. I can add an additional front end, trash can this one if I don't want it. Back end app pool, I can add another pool here. Again, I can trash it. Here's where I stick the two together with my routing rules. Very similar to what we did with the load balancer. So I'm going to add a routing rule, and these actually give me a lot of flexibility. I'm going to do this one for default traffic, and then I'm going to give it a name, or not a name, a priority. The priority can be anywhere between 1 and 20,000, where 1 is the highest priority and 20,000 is the lowest priority. So I'm going to set this to 100 just for the fun of it. So my listener name. Now, this is the listener name is going to be tied to this rule. This is going to be for default traffic. I'm going to do it in a public IPv4, and I can choose HTTP or HTTPS. Either way, whichever one I set, it's going to change things down here a little bit. So I'm going to do HTTP, and listener type can be either basic or multi-site. Now, multi-site is, let me pull this so you can see this right here. Multi-site is if you're configuring more than one web application or multiple subdomains of the same parent domain, then we'd use a multi-site listener. If you're doing a single site, then we're using a basic listener. So I'm just doing a single site. I'm not doing multiple websites for this demo. So I'm going to leave this as basic. But if I was doing multiple sites, then I can use multi-site. And what will happen is when traffic comes into this IP address, the listener then will look and see what's the name of the site they're trying to reach, and we'll redirect them. Even though they're using the same IP address, we'll redirect them to the right backend servers. So it lets you basically run multiple sites on a single IP address. We can specify our own bad gateway and forbidden error messages down here if we want, or we can just use the default ones and then show more status codes if you want to do more customized messaging. So I'm going to click add, and then I always do this. So we've got our listener defined here. Up here, we've got to do the backend targets. I'll try to go to the next page to do that. The backend targets are here. So where are we sending things to? So target type, we can do a backend pool, and I'm going to click my drop down, and I'm just going to go to this app pool that I created. I can also do a redirection. And then right here are backend settings. Now I have nothing predefined here, so I have to create a new one. So this traffic coming in, my default traffic, rule 100, is going to go to my backend pool. And then I'm going to set some settings for how this works. I'm just going to call this backend settings, just for the fun of it. Okay, HTTP, how are we going to handle this? So which port are we going to? Which protocol are we working on? Which port are we going? Which protocol are we working on? Which port are we working with? Notice HTTPS is going to require certificate files and things like that. So do I want to do cookie-based affinity? So affinity means, hey, if we're sending traffic, if we have a cookie here and they've attached to one server in our backend pool, do we want them to always do the same one? That's cookie-based affinity. So I can enable or disable that. By default, it's disabled. Connection draining. Connection draining means basically, let's say I take down one of my backend servers. When I take that down, connection draining, what it'll do is rather than taking down the server, it'll hold that up and it'll start draining those connections. So connections that are currently established, it will keep until they disconnect, but it will not add any more. So what happens is the number of connections will slowly drop until there are none left, and then you can take down that backend server without creating problems for anybody. So we have a request timed out. I'm going to go ahead and turn on connection draining, and then drain time, I can set the number of seconds for it. Let's do 10 minutes. So it's going to be 600 seconds. Request timed out, and then backend path. And then by default, the application gateway sends the same HTTP host header to the backend that it receives from the client. If your backend application service requires a specific header, you override that. But we can just use the host name, and that will be fine. So at this point, I can go ahead and click add. And that's going to create my routing rule, almost create my routing rule. One other thing I want to point out here is add multiple paths to create, or multiple targets to create a path-based rule. So basically what that means is if I have a website set up and it's a large website, I can literally have some servers handle part of it and other servers handle another part of it. So not a single server has to handle everything. Where we will frequently see this is when we have a website and maybe we have a bunch of files linked for downloads. So rather than tying up our standard servers, maybe we'll set up some servers specifically to handle those downloads. So when somebody's browsing our website, they click the link to download a file, it will redirect them on that path-based rule to one of those servers in that pool that's set up just for downloads. That's an example of where we would use a path-based rule. So I'm going to click Add, and here is my front end, my routing rule, and my back end pools. And honestly speaking, as your website goes, you're probably going to add multiple routing rules here. But for the moment, we're just going to go with this one. So I'm going to review and create, and then create. Validation passed. It's doing its deployment. Deployment is submitted. Now, this might take it a little while. So I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I'm going to come back, and we're going to pick it up once this has completed. Okay, so our deployment is complete. So we can click here to go to the resource, or we can navigate to it through normal means, whichever. Either way, it takes us to our overview of our gateway. So we see total request, failed request, response by. If you want to configure the gateway, actually, you know what? I'm going to bail out here and I'm going to go home. Now, both of these things we talked about being under load balancers, right? So if I do a search for load, I'm going to find my load balancers. And when I come here, here's going to be my load balancer. Here's where we created one before. I went ahead and deleted it because I wasn't using it at the moment. Here's going to be our application gateway. And we can click on our application gateways. And then just like with the load balancers, this is going to give us an overview of how we're using it. Front-end public IP address, front-end private IP address if we have one. Here's where we start going through our configuration. So our configuration, our web application firewall, here's where we're going to manage our backend pools, including, I can come in here and I can start adding targets and associate rules with this particular backend pool. Let me come back a little bit farther. Oh, get to the right spot. There we go. Our backend pools, our backend settings, our front-end IP configurations, our rules when we want to add more of them or modify the ones they're here, and I can add another routing rule. So here's where I'm going to manage all of my application or my application gateways. So remember, that web application gateways work great with you just lost my train of thought. We're great with web applications. That's what they're designed for. Load balancers can work with websites or other types of services. So the application gateway is going to give you more flexibility as far as redirecting things based on multiple sites or paths or anything else that's happening at that level 7. The load balancer can't do that. So the one that you pick, load balancer, web application gateway, depends on what it is that you need to accomplish. But hopefully now you know enough that you can configure a basic web application gateway.